This is the fourth episode of Primary School, a podcast about New York's 2025 mayoral primary focused on the issues that matter most to students and young voters. I'm Eli Miller. I'm 26 years old. I'm a lifelong New Yorker and a huge fan of the band The Decemberists, extra hard Sudoku puzzles from the YouTube channel Cracking the Cryptic, and the Fat Boy Sandwich from Psycho, a Syrian-Korean fusion place right around the corner from where I live. I've known my guest today, Jeongyoon Han, since we met during our freshman year at the first orchestra rehearsal of our college orchestra. She spent all 4 years of college working on our student newspaper, eventually becoming editor-in-chief. Since then, she's become an actual grown-up journalist. She's worked at NPR in DC for a few years covering elections, and she recently moved to Albany to be the State House reporter for WXXI, the public radio station for Rochester and the surrounding area. She's only been there a few months, but she's already been busy covering prison strikes, tense budget negotiations, and crises related to the Trump administration and looming budget cuts. Since the state has immense power over City Hall, all of this is extremely relevant to the upcoming mayoral election, so I'm so excited to share my conversation with Jeongyoon Han. Jeongyoon Han, welcome to the show. Thank you so much for being here.
Hey, thanks for having me.
So I have a bunch of questions for you about the budget, about generally how things work in Albany and how they affect the city government. But I want to start with something that you wrote this weekend. We're recording this on Sunday, April 13th. And on Friday, you wrote this article about this big bombshell report about Cuomo and hundreds of millions of dollars of medical equipment. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, this was a report that the state comptroller released on Friday. His name is Tom DiNapoli. He spoke with officials in the Department of Health and officials in the Office of General Services to look back at what kinds of payments the state made during the pandemic. And turns out the state spent about $452 million on medical equipment, things like oxygen tanks, ventilators, things to measure your airway systems and how that's going, all the things that you generally would need to fight a pandemic like the COVID pandemic. Turns out of the purchases that the comptroller's office reviewed, there were 250,000 medical devices purchased, but only 3 of them were ever distributed. And that was an x-ray machine and then 2 ventilators for anyone who's keeping track of what things were distributed. And then another detail about this was that there were about $300,000 worth of credit card purchases, and those purchases no one could account for. This obviously happened in 2020, and just to bring us back 5 years ago, this was a period where certain protocols were suspended because obviously this is a public health emergency. And so you saw a lot of states go through this, and so did New York. But the report that we have now, 5 years later, highlights the fact that in the face of these protocols being suspended, purchases were made that wasn't fully accounted for or tracked, leading us to see only 3 items being distributed from $452 million worth of things bought.
That's incredible. And obviously the image that we all have of Cuomo during that time is this heroic sort of Churchillian leader who was the calm in the eye of the storm, but was also just a competent manager who was getting things done and was focused on solving problems. And so wait, but what, did it just sit in a warehouse, or where is that equipment?
Yeah, a bunch of those items still sit in storage facilities across the state, and obviously storing them in facilities also costs money. There's been a plan that the Department of Health made to account for a certain chunk of those items. I think it's around 50,000 of them, but the rest, there's still no plan yet. So that is up to the state to figure out. And the comptroller did suggest in the future that there be a better plan to outline how you would manage if there are any surplus items. That's on the Department of Health.
Seems like a good suggestion.
Seems like a good suggestion. The other suggestion, which also seems like a good suggestion, is that the Office of General Services that manages some of the logistics for the state should have some guardrails about how the state should get some emergency items in the future, which I think everyone can agree on. The reason why I feel like this matters now is obviously Cuomo's running for mayor. We buried the lead. And he has for many years, like you said, kind of presented himself as someone who can be a great emergency leader in time of struggle. Like you saw how he led the state during Hurricane Sandy and Hurricane Irene in the 2010s. A lot of leaders who worked with him back then will say now that he was really interested in leading the state during times of natural disaster or certain struggles. And obviously he branded himself as a strong leader during COVID in the early start of the pandemic. But we saw that image start to turn on itself with the cases of deaths of elderly patients in nursing home facilities. That scandal obviously played a part in his ultimate resignation in 2021. But then we're seeing him trying to return back into the political arena by running for mayor. So it's an interesting turn of events.
For sure. So 2 questions. One, in the last 2 days, what is your sense of how much of an impact is this making? Do you see people reacting to this in ways that are surprising or that like make it seem like it's changing things? Is this getting buried? Mm-hmm. Has he come out with a response? What's that looking like?
Yeah, I mean, on Twitter at least, or formerly called Twitter, now known as X, there is
the everything app.
The everything app where everyone chats. I've seen a good number of discussion among different politicians, state leaders, and individuals say that this was a waste of taxpayers' interest. And that was a line that the state comptroller wrote in his report. He said that this highlighted the failure from the state, led by Cuomo at the time, to fulfill, quote, responsible management and planning and use of public resources for the protection of the state and taxpayers' interests, end quote. But I did speak with Rich Azzopardi, who is Cuomo's spokesperson right now, and he said that this was a sign of the state proactively securing supplies if the state needed it. Their position is we would rather be in a place where we didn't end up needing items than being short in supply of them. He told me that it's, quote, good news that we didn't have to distribute all these ventilators. He also contested essentially the big claim of this whole report, which was that the state only distributed 3 items of the medical equipment. From his recollection and from the administration's recollection, they distributed far more, although he did not provide specifics of how much or when.
Yeah. Well, it's just interesting because, like, with the nursing home stuff and with certainly with the sexual assault allegations, it seems like everyone's just having a lot of amnesia and sort of blocking out, like, that didn't happen sort of thing. And I've been wondering, like, what will it take to puncture that? Will anything puncture that? And I have to think that if anything could, we misused hundreds of millions of dollars and bought a bunch of stuff that we never used. Seems like the kind of thing that could do it. So I'll just be watching that really closely to see how the other candidates respond to it and how whether that makes an impact.
For sure.
Because I think that line from our buddy Rich does not seem, personally, I don't find that compelling. It's like, oh, you spent $100 million extra dollars or $400 million extra dollars on just in case. Like, my second question is, and I've seen you cover this before, how are other sort of like state officials looking back on the Cuomo years as governor as they frame his run for mayor? I know obviously the story that he and his people would like to tell is, I was a hugely successful governor. Did I make some mistakes? Maybe, but you know me, you love me. I was great. I know how this government works. I'm a great manager. And I saw you did some reporting on how different people upstate are reacting to that claim. So tell me about that.
Sure, yeah. And I'll speak with people who I spoke with on the local level who remember him in a more positive light. They'll recall how on a state level, Cuomo was able to pass a lot of major pieces of legislation, stricter gun controls, in the aftermath of the Sandy Hook Elementary School shooting in Connecticut. New York was one of the earlier states to see same-sex legislation go into effect. That was, again, under Cuomo's tenure. He also will say that he prevented tax rate increases for the middle and upper classes, too. So he has big picture state level things that he accomplished. That is true, and no one will contest that probably. Where I think I've seen a little bit of different opinions about how local leaders remember Cuomo's tenure is based on how he treated local leadership, local authority in certain instances. I think the best example of this is how he treated then Mayor Bill de Blasio. They had overlap when de Blasio was mayor from 2014 to 2021. It started off as a really strong friendship, as both of them would say, but then quickly turned into a rivalry, basically over who had larger control over the city. Cuomo shot down some key ideas that de Blasio had to try to fund de Blasio's universal pre-K plan in the city. Sometimes they didn't give each other enough notice ahead of time about certain decisions that they were going to make. And that started in 2015 and kind of continued all the way down to when de Blasio finished his term and then Cuomo resigned. The line that de Blasio said during an interview in 2015 was, "What we've often seen is if someone disagrees with him openly, some kind of revenge or vendetta follows." And I've heard that be said by other leaders that I spoke with in some form, that according to these people, Cuomo was so invested in achieving policies in the way that he wanted, so that if people disagreed with him, he would hold that against those leaders and their cities in some form. I spoke with the former mayor of Syracuse, Stephanie Miner, about this. She came out disagreeing with him on his pension plan in the 2013 state budget, and she wrote an op-ed about that in the New York Times, saying that she respectfully disagreed with him, although she saw him as an ally as well. She claims after that op-ed came out that Cuomo directed the state to withhold funds that she had already secured to make certain infrastructure improvements in her city, like broadband access, building roads, expanding water resources. And that's just one example of something that I've heard from local leaders who say that he would Bigfoot them, not really listen to what the community needed, and would follow his own vision, even if it meant butting heads with local leaders. And so some of those people who I've spoken with find it ironic that he's now running to be a leader, a local leader, like one of them. But still, he's a polarizing figure, and you will also have local leaders who say that they very much saw him as a unifying leader who could get things done, even if it meant sometimes butting heads, but never because of a personal vendetta, more because this is just the nature of the business to work in politics. The bottom line, though, is regardless of what the local leaders think, he still has a really commanding lead over all the other candidates. So it's just it's going to be a test, really, of how much of that more positive legacy or the more negative legacy that Cuomo has, which one will kind of, be remembered in the voters' minds come June.
Right. And it's just so interesting because what you're describing there, I mean, it's incredibly Trumpian, right? The idea of like, I'm going to cut funding to something that we've previously agreed to grant, like we've signed a grant, you're receiving this money, but I'm going to arbitrarily cut it for political reasons because I disagree with you is like exactly the Doge playbook that we're seeing right now. But
in the Cuomo's defense, I asked his spokesperson Rich Party about it, but he didn't provide any direct comment to that specific claim that former Mayor Miner alleged. He did say he found it odd that the mayor would be coming out with these claims and allegations in a book that she published in March about her experiences being mayor. He just said it was interesting timing.
Right.
Yeah.
And of course, I mean, there's two sides to everything, and maybe that particular grant had things we don't know about. I'm sure they would say like there were other reasons. But
sure,
if we accept this narrative, the other thing about it is that as a political strategy, it has a logic, right? Like if you are right now the leader of a union in New York City, or if you're a state senator or some other local leader, on one hand you might have strong disagreements with Cuomo, and you might think that there's a better candidate for your constituency. But you have to be very careful about coming out against him if his reputation is that of this sort of revenge-seeking vendetta holder, because if you come out against him and he wins, as it looks like he has an increasing chance of doing, then you're potentially in bad shape. And it's like, is it worth making that risk for your constituents to just get your opinion out there? I think it's a very delicate balance that these local leaders are now faced with. Okay, so that's the background with Cuomo. One other thing that Cuomo was famous for when he was governor was having domineering, commanding control over the budget process. So right now, it's April 13th. correct me if I'm wrong, we don't have a budget yet, right?
No,
So
we don't have a
we're
budget.
13 days and counting past the deadline. Can you tell us a little bit about what the budget process is supposed to look like and what's taking so long?
Yeah, like you said, then Governor Cuomo had a large presence in how the budget was constructed. That's also because every governor has a large amount of power in this process. That's how the budget process has been constructed. The way that it works, which I really didn't understand, was that it truly is essentially three leaders in the room talking over what the budget should look like. That's the governor, and then the Senate Majority Leader, and then the Speaker of the State Assembly. It's truly behind closed doors. Three people, maybe sometimes their aides will come in, sometimes counsel will go in to litigate some things, but to craft the essence of what the funding plan will look like for the upcoming year is decided by those three people, and the governor has a large sway in this.
It's like in Hamilton.
It's like the old vision of politics where it's people just talking and figuring out the plan for the whole state or the whole country. This is kind of the idea that I had of politics in its perhaps not good form, and this is it, because it's not a transparent process. It's not up to a vote of all of the members of the Senate or the Assembly. It's three people, and two of the leaders are trying to best represent the opinions that their conference and their chambers have. But on one level, it's obviously meant to set the fiscal plan for the upcoming year. It's a $252 billion budget that we have on the table as how the governor initially proposed it in January. And always we see the budget go to big spending operations like Medicaid and education. Those are the two biggest spending items basically every year. And then there are other, budgets and fiscal plans and issues to sort out, like how much state workers are going to get paid, like how much money is going to go to the prison system, all that sort of stuff. But there's this other part of the budget that allows for policy matters to be brought into the mix, because the view generally is that sometimes policy matters need to be changed or updated, put into the budget to best execute the budget for the upcoming year. So the governor has a lot of power to be able to introduce policy matters if it's of her view that they would help achieve the budget for the upcoming year. So she put in some proposals that have shaken up the budget process. There's one to ban cell phones in schools bell to bell, which seems to be, having large consensus support and will probably go as generally planned, maybe some tweaks. The other one would be about banning masks and making it essentially criminalizing conduct where individuals wear masks in public spaces. The concern there is about free speech and what that means for the right for people to protest. So that has been met with much resistance. And then the last one is about discovery, which is how evidence is shared in criminal trials. And that's been the major logjam for the budget and why we are heading into the latter half of April without a budget still.
Yeah, and are you hearing anything about, like, obviously, putting aside your objective reporter hat, if you had to speculate, like, my impression of issues like this is that eventually the side with, centrist consensus and all the DAs and the moderates, like, that's the side that's going to win out over the progressives who are, trying to pump the brakes on this. But do you see like a resolution in either direction, or is it like a true logjam where and it's behind closed doors, so we really have no way of knowing?
I think it's a true logjam. The governor's proposal about discovery, just for context, is to essentially make changes to laws that were enacted in 2020 to dictate how evidence should be shared in criminal trials. Public defenders have said before the 2019 laws were passed, they had to operate with little notice about any evidence that would come to them. Like sometimes they said that they were essentially blindfolded, that prosecutors would only share evidence the day of having to go and make a plea deal, so that essentially public defenders had no idea of really assessing what the case was against them and if their defendant would be better off taking a plea bargain or going to trial. So a lot of public defenders have championed the changes that came in 2020. The governor wants to make certain changes to that, and we don't need to go into all the details, but essentially lots of lawmakers and public defenders have come out saying that these proposals would roll back all of the changes that happened in 2020. And they just don't even say it as tweaks, which is how Hochul and DAs will put it. These public defenders, these lawmakers are essentially saying this would be an entire rollback. So it's pretty much black and white as it gets in terms of where state lawmakers stand and where Governor Hochul stands. And the governor has said in recent weeks that she will not compromise on principles, this being one of them. And she also said, kind of slyly, but also jokingly and very seriously, that summers are very nice in Albany, which is to say that she is willing to do whatever it takes, and as long as it takes, to get what she thinks is the best proposal in the budget. And that could mean, pushing this budget process well past April 1st, which is, out of the question obviously now, and well into the summer.
Wow. Does that normally happen? Like, how long does it normally go?
I can't remember the longest delay, but it's, at the very minimum, I'll be able to tell you that it's unheard of to suggest having the state budget go into the summer.
And are there things that would start to break? Obviously, they're passing some sort of like week by week stopgap situation. Mm-hmm. Are there like big deadlines where, like, if the budget isn't passed in a month, then an important thing that people would, are there things that would start to lose funding, or like new programs that wouldn't be able to start on time, or what's at stake every day that it keeps getting delayed?
Yeah, there are extenders that go for a few days at a time to be able to make sure that state workers get paid the essential aspects of running the whole state. But I will say broadly, the concern with dragging this process out for this year is that this is the first year of the Trump administration, and we're already seeing the administration choose to cut certain kinds of funding and slash certain parts of the federal government. We haven't seen all of the president's plans on a state level of what kinds of federal funding he plans to cut. Obviously, the big concern is that he would cut Social Security, healthcare, Medicaid, and those are the biggest chunks of the state budget. If the state doesn't have a plan sorted right now, it makes the state more vulnerable to not being able to respond effectively to whatever the Trump administration will plan on doing. So there are always, not great things about having the budget passed late. But I think the threat and uncertainty that is being presented by the Trump administration only makes that question more urgent for the state to have to figure out.
Totally. And that, I guess, on both sides means that there's a lot of pressure to cave. And the fact that neither one has is all the more remarkable about how divisive this issue is. Well, something that's really struck me about this discovery issue is the politics of the different rhetoric that people are using. I think everyone on one side of it is really focused on using the word tweak. The NYPD police chief said tweaks. All 5 DAs wrote an op-ed where the headline was minor tweaks to this bill. They're closing loopholes, tightening it up a little bit. I had a guest on, Whitney Tilson, who's running for mayor, and he talked about this issue and how it was really important to tighten up that law a little bit. Mm-hmm. And I think that just is a really interesting reflection, not only of the law as a whole, but of the feeling, which is that we don't want to undo the spirit of 2019. We agree with criminal justice reform. It was good that we were fighting for racial justice and trying to reduce the harms of mass incarceration, but we just need to make it a little bit more efficient and work a little bit smoother. And I think that's a compelling narrative and like maybe even a little bit of a metaphor for how a lot of people in New York are feeling right now, which is that, like, the things that we were very passionate about in 2019, we don't want to abandon, but we want to, maybe we went a little bit too far. And then it's just interesting to see in what places people are willing to, backtrack a little bit versus what places people are like, actually, we want to undo all of this.
Yeah, the governor has a year until she's going to run for re-election. And that first time that she ran was a little bit closer than would have been comfortable for any Democratic candidate running for governor in New York. And we saw in the presidential election in 2024 that the state is becoming a little bit more moderate, and the big issues that are swaying more conservative voters is public safety and immigration.
And it's not just the general election against a Republican that she has to worry about. Richie Torres is gearing up to probably challenge her in a primary. I know her lieutenant governor is also making moves to see if that's a possibility for him. And I think in both cases, those are people who take a sort of moderate, more like hard line on criminal justice issues. Torres has endorsed Cuomo. And just briefly to run through the mayoral candidates, Cuomo and Eric Adams are both strongly in favor of the discovery reform rollbacks that she's proposing, as is Whitney Tilson, who I talked to. What I find interesting is that the rest of the candidates seem pretty quiet on this issue. We looked pretty hard to find other candidates who had a comment about it, and it seems like most of them have tried to avoid it a little bit. The one person who is talking about it in a different way is Zellner Myrie, who has a specific proposal to reform discovery in a different way, which is just a technical thing about giving prosecutors automatic access to police data, which is a way to solve some of these problems without changing the rules about what they have to change to show to public defenders. So that's where he's at. The fact that all of these candidates are pretty quiet on it just makes it more surprising that in Albany there's enough resistance that it's still getting held up. So that's super interesting. So this is a good setup for the other big issue that I've seen you cover. You've only been there, like 3 months or something? And you've already...
Yes.
It's been a very busy 3 months for you, it seems like.
It's been very fun.
The other big story that I saw you do a lot of really great coverage on was the prison strikes that were happening across the state. Yeah, tell us a little about that and how they fit in with this conversation about, criminal justice reform and the progressive movement of the late 2010s.
So we saw a prison strike made by corrections officers across the state. It started on February 17th, and it lasted 22 days into March. At its peak, 9 out of 10 corrections officers walk off the job. The state has long held understaffing issues in its correction system, which has led to corrections officers being overworked, burnt out, having to work sometimes as long as 24-hour shifts, 2-day shifts almost at times. And we've also seen increasing violence, instances of inmate-on-inmate violence, instances on incarcerated individuals on staff violence increase by 85%, and then staff on inmate violence has also increased. Violence across the board has increased in these systems, making it feel unsafe for incarcerated people and corrections officers. So those concerns over public safety within the system and then the staffing issues were two of the big drivers that led to people go off the line. And the other part of it is that corrections officers have been concerned about this one piece of legislation called the HALT Act that was passed in the early 2010s but took a long time to get enacted. It was only enacted and put into effect in the last few years. It sets limitations on how long incarcerated people can be put in solitary confinement. The law says that a person can only be in solitary confinement for 15 days straight, and then within a 60-day period, the person can only be in confinement for 20 days. Corrections officers say that doesn't help with safety concerns, that they need more time to put a person in solitary confinement so that they can separate quote-unquote violent individuals from the rest of the prison population. So on the staffing issues, the safety issues, and then this issue over HALT, the corrections officers walked off the job. The state tried to go through negotiations and deals with corrections officers, and they tried once in late February to have a plan that gave some assurances for more overtime pay and ways to make sure that workers wouldn't have to stay 24 hours on the job, but that wasn't enough to their demands. And so it took another week or two to have a second deal that sealed the deal enough for these corrections officers to return back to the job. But at the end of it, all to say, the governor had to bring in the National Guard. 3,500 troops. And at its peak, it was around 6,000. They're still in prisons right now, helping to make up for the staffing shortages. The state also fired 2,000 corrections officers because they walked off the job for 10 consecutive days, according to the state. So having the National Guard in is costing the state $100 million a month. They are now short not just 2,000 officers, but 4,000 corrections officers because there is a huge staffing shortage even before the strike occurred. And then also incarcerated people were left without access to good food or medical care and educational programs during this 3-week strike. And we also saw at least seven incarcerated people die during the strike. It's unsure if their deaths were related to the strike or not, but it's only highlighted even further the precarious state that the prison system is in. So New York has some key questions that they're going to have to try to figure out is how are they going to recruit more corrections officers to work in these facilities? How are they going to make prisons safer for incarcerated people and for corrections officers? And then what are they going to do about this piece of legislation, the HALT Act, that is supposed to set limitations to solitary confinement? This also is playing into the budget so far because the governor put in a plan to close up to 5 prisons as a way to ease staffing shortage issues, but that has been met with a lot of resistance from Republican lawmakers who say that this is cutting jobs for corrections officers who work in rural places in upstate, and it's not realistic to have that as part of the budget. It's not clear what the answer is going to be and what the path forward is. It's going to be something that I'm going to have to cover for the next few months because it does not seem resolved.
Have you been going to some of these events that, like, I've seen some of the corrections officers that have been fired have been organizing these, like, protests? I know also, like, part of the wrinkle here is that, like, the strike was, like, part of it was, like, a wildcat strike, so it wasn't with official union authorization. So, like, the head of the union who you talk to might have a very different message than some of the people who are in these. You've just been talking to everyone and driving around and going to all these different prisons and stuff, and
I actually have not been able to go to any prisons just yet because a lot of the job is focused on what is happening in the Capitol. But we did see a lot of organized protests and lawmakers and corrections officers and their families come to the Capitol to speak on this issue. Yet, like you said, this was an unsanctioned strike. The corrections officers union did not sanction it. And so that was what made this, like, illegal in the eyes of the state. This is a very sore subject for corrections officers because they will say that they were protesting and refusing to work because of public safety issues and because they've been subjected to working 24-hour shifts, which is not humane. That has technically been allowed within the corrections officers union's contract with the state, that they are allowed to have mandated overtime shifts. But overall, corrections officers who have been fired feel very much upset and distrusting of the state for firing them for not showing up to work for 10 consecutive days. But I think the most interesting thing that I've seen from this is that some of the corrections officers who have been fired and their families have come out to say that while they still think that they should be hired back and that there should be some resolution between the state about this employment aspect of the strike, some corrections officers have come around to supporting the solitary confinement law, the HALT Act, in some form. I don't know. I think it says a lot about the fact that sometimes with a wildcat strike or a strike that isn't organized by their union, it's a lot of different individuals coming together to try to rally around certain issues. And at first, we saw a lot of support to repeal the HALT Act from the corrections officers. But in recent weeks, I've seen a little bit more of a nuanced approach among different parts of this big conglomerate of people, or this big, like, umbrella of corrections officers. So the state has said that they're going to look into the HALT Act and investigate how effectively it's been implemented in different prisons. We have still a Democratic majority leadership in Albany, so it's hard to imagine this law being repealed. But the question is, what can the state do better to implement solitary confinement restrictions while also, making it safer for corrections officers to work and also more manageable for them instead of having to do insanely long shifts.
Totally. And this is just, it's all super fascinating, and it just raises the stakes even more for the, discovery reform stuff and the other criminal justice reform stuff that, this is what the other end of the system looks like. So you've been covering a ton of different stuff. It's a very high volume, high velocity news time right now.
Yeah.
But it seems like it hasn't all been, high stakes, grim, intense corrections officers and late night budget meetings. And there's also been some lighter stuff. What can you tell me about this squirrel? What's going on with Peanut?
Oh, gosh. I mean, that might be lighter or not, depending on who you talk to.
Okay.
For context, so this is a bill that was proposed in recent days by Republican Assemblyman Jake Blumenkrantz from Nassau. It's called Peanut's Law. It would require that the Department of Environmental Conservation wait 3 days before euthanizing any animals that they seize. And this is the namesake of this law is Peanut the squirrel, which is an insane story. So Peanut the squirrel was a squirrel that this one family in upstate New York took into their house. It was a wild animal, but they rehabilitated it. There were also several other animals. There was like Fred the squirrel, and there was a raccoon that they also rehabilitated and let into their house. This was all in the fall of 2024, and Peanut the squirrel became an internet sensation on social media. And there are lots of pictures of this little squirrel with a little cowboy hat. And while the public really seemed to enjoy Peanut the squirrel's social media personality, this was for some of this family's neighbors like an animal safety concern. And so the Department of Environmental Conservation got anonymous calls and tips that there were wild animals in people's homes. And so the DEC went and made a visit this past fall, and the squirrel bit one of the handlers who came to check in on the house. Because of that, the state had to decapitate, which is really sad.
Oh my God.
Decapitate Peanut the squirrel because they had to test the animal for rabies. Turns out Peanut the squirrel did not have rabies. It came out negative. Innocent, seemingly innocent. And so this caused massive backlash on the internet and across the public over this. And so this Republican lawmaker is trying to make more protections through this bill for seized animals. It's hard to imagine this going through and getting passed, but it's just been introduced, so maybe things could change in the coming weeks.
To all my animal rights listeners, I didn't mean to make light of a serious issue, and all lives are precious. And,
oh, that's a statement.
Well, yeah. Peace and love to all the small animals across this great state. Jeongyoon, thank you so much for coming on this podcast. It's been so much fun to talk to you and hear about all the crazy things you're covering and the wild times that we're in state government. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me. And for the listeners who don't know, Eli and I used to be in a string quartet together in college, so it's fun to be able to see us talk not just about music, but about New York politics too.
Yes, next time I'll have Jeongyoon Han. We'll just talk about Shostakovich string quartets, and everyone's going to love that episode. It's going to be great. Well, thank you so much for doing this. I really appreciate it. It's so good to see you.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for listening to my conversation with Jeongyoon Han. It was produced by Oliver Heller, Lucy Ackman, Sean Heaney, and Jonathan Jalbert. Edited by Sean and Jonathan. Sean also recorded the music that you're hearing right now. Our cover art was by Charlotte Heller. On our next episode, I'll speak to advocate and urban planning expert Tom Fox. In the meantime, you can follow us at Primary School NYC on Instagram and probably on other social media platforms soon. Our YouTube channel is called Primary School Podcast, and you can listen to us there or wherever else you listen to podcasts. Thanks so much for listening. The election is on June 24th.